Gee whiz, my dude, what's it like to be a horror enthusiast? I don't know, I just am. Hi, howdy, what up, my dudes? So today we're talking about something that is very different. iMDb on the 22nd of October, of course, leading up to our classic Halloween, posted on Facebook saying which of these is the ultimate 80s horror film. Here are the posters of the movies that they entailed. Friday the 13th, The Shining, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Poltergeist, John Carpenter's The Thing, The Evil Dead, Fright Night, and The Fly. My mate commented asking what my thoughts were. He's like, hey, Julian, what do you think? Which one do you think's the ultimate one? His thoughts were The Thing, because for him it's a more favourite film of his, out of all the top. And I'm going to read to you what I wrote in response. Not as a hate against him, just as a analysis of all of the films, and which one I personally believe to be the ultimate 80s horror film in this considered list from iMDb. I said, The Thing is a masterpiece as much as The Evil Dead. However, The Evil Dead has a perfectly 80s low-budget feel and was successful at the box office enough to become iconic and a cult classic to a larger audience immediately with its midnight screenings, a very 80s horror thing. Though The Thing is more appreciated today, it just wasn't back then, so I can't consider it so highly. The same can be said for a lot of the others. For example, The Shining is a bit too art house for most people, especially because it's a Stanley Kubrick film. Friday the 13th is iconic as a franchise, but its killer and its kills, especially with Jason. The first one is slow and kind of meh. It's a decent slasher, but as an overall, it gets better in the sequels, especially when they actually introduce Jason. And that only gets better by, ultimately, the final chapter in Jason Lives, which are the best two of the franchise, in my opinion. Fright Night I do love, but isn't as talked about, probably because vampire films are always around. A Nightmare on Elm Street came by post the initial slasher craze, which was in like 84 or whatever. This is 6 years after Halloween, and the amount of slasher films that had come out by that stage was fucking trucks full. So then it's like, hey, let's give you a new slasher film that's a bit reinvigorating, and then bamboozle the whole franchise. And it only stood out, honestly, because of its different slasher take due to the villain and the dream powers. Poltergeist is iconic like they all are, but also it's so iconically 80s, but more as a Spielberg horror, even though he didn't direct it. So I wouldn't consider it as... It feels like it's set in the 80s, but it doesn't feel like an 80s film per se. But it just, for me, doesn't stretch the most iconic framing there. Like, it feels less of a iconic 80s horror film and more of a iconic Spielberg film. I know, again, Tobe Hooper directed it, but Spielberg wrote it, produced it, and arguably co-directed it, depending on who you ask. Nevertheless, lastly, of course, The Fly falls under the same category. Iconic now, but too gory and disturbing for mass audiences. Now, I could be wrong about that aspect, but I don't know. I'd still say it was these were all popular enough in their day, but that's why I ultimately think that The Evil Dead is the most iconic of all of these 80s films. There are obvious movies that have a lot of pop culture references. Realistically, all of these have some kind of a pop culture reference in later things, especially like The Simpsons and whatever. And all of these can be considered very differently. Friday the 13th is a interesting, voyeuristic slasher film, with an interesting twist ending and even an interesting last scare. It's got some great blood and gore effects, which makes it really a very iconic slasher film, and even though it was riffing on Halloween, Halloween wasn't released until 1978. This came in the 80s. So this is, unfortunately, 80s, whereas Halloween isn't an 80s film. I know it feels like it, but it isn't an 80s film. The Shining, again, it's long, 2.5 hours. It's atmospheric. It's performance-driven. Most of the jump scares come from title cards, Wednesday. And it's not, I mean, I know there's a lot of horrific imagery, like the two twins, the Grady twins, there's the bloody elevator, there's all that kind of stuff. For me personally, it never scared me, but I still think it's very iconic. I wouldn't say it is the ultimate of the 80s horror films, so I'd actually probably say Friday the 13th is a bit more above it, just in the factor of how it could appeal to its audiences. Friday the 13th, though considered by a lot of people to be egregiously stupid and dumb, is just what people wanted in the 80s, and it led the 80s. Like, The Shining didn't. The Shining's influences, it did probably have influence on a lot of things, however, it didn't have as much obvious influence. Whereas Friday the 13th is a very easy formula that was already ripping off another formula, and it just became its own version of, hey, this is how you should do the 80s slasher film from here on out. Have a voyeuristic villain or a villain in a mask, which of course came in the second film, and which of course was already in Halloween, and just get teenagers who have sex and drink or take drugs to get murdered. You know, we've all watched Scream by now, so we all know the rules. A Nightmare on Elm Street, again, because it's already post that whole slasher craze, which again, the slasher craze kept going until, what, 96? It's fucking still, oh my god, it's still going! Anyway, watch my video on the death of the slasher film. I'd say, look, Nightmare on Elm Street is still very iconic. I don't know how many people have watched it, though. Obviously, it's very well watched to the point of it created a whole fucking franchise. But it's the same thing as, like, Friday the 13th. How many people watched the original? Like, a lot of people might know that Kevin Bacon was in it, but they know it for Jason. They wouldn't remember the fact, they might not know the fact that Pamela Voorhees, Jason's mother, was the killer in the original. And Nightmare on Elm Street is still very iconic and is probably the best of the slasher films, next to Halloween. They're both masterpieces of their own right, one being an urban slasher that, you know, scary during the day, whereas the other one's an urban slasher scary during the night because it's in your dreams. It's the perfect dichotomy. You know, Friday the 13th is just a camping movie. You know? I wouldn't really partner them all together, but then at the same time, Jason, they've all got great masked villains, more or less, even though Freddy isn't masked. I guess he's masked by the subconscious? Anyway, Poltergeist, again, it doesn't feel like an iconic, like, it's still an iconic 80s film. There's a lot of fucking iconic horror 80s films, because a lot of the best horror films have come out in the 80s, you know, a lot of the most iconic ones to pop culture today. And it did spawn a trilogy, and it did scare a lot of people. But again, there's this element of, what do you remember it for most? Do you remember it for, obviously there's the quotes of "they're here," and obviously the little girl. There's, you know, do you remember it as a horror film or as a Spielberg film? I know a lot of people might be like, I don't, the fuck does that mean? It's like, think about it. You watch E.T., you watch Close Encounters, they're all the same fucking movie, pretty much. They're not, of course, but Spielberg has this 80s horror essence to it, this supernatural essence, where it's all in the neighborhoods, all, you know, that modern day kind of nuclear family stuff, but in the 80s. You know, again, this one's written by him, not directed by him because of a clause in his contract. I've done that as well in a Spielberg and horror video. But it just doesn't stretch out for me as far as, like, if someone's to mention 80s horror films, they'd probably definitely mention A Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th, and probably even The Evil Dead over Poltergeist. Poltergeist I wouldn't consider as something people would scream to first as an 80s horror film. Of course, there's a personal opinion there, and I could be completely wrong by other people's standards, but this is just how I'm perceiving it. And to be fair, of all these films, that one was the first one I watched. Of all these films, I watched Poltergeist first, I think The Evil Dead and The Shining, and then The Thing, then Fright Night and The Fly, and then Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street. So it's only taken me until, like, these last 3 years to watch films like Fright Night, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, and The Fly. Whereas, again, I grew up watching Poltergeist. I'd seen The Shining in high school, and I've seen it pretty much every year since. The Thing I've seen every year since I think I graduated high school, or I started my last year of high school. So that's been in the last 4 years. And The Evil Dead, same deal. For the past 4 years, I've been watching it yearly. Then you got The Thing. Now again, like I said, The Thing was a box office failure. It wasn't so critically regarded. Now it's considered a masterpiece. I love it. It's one of my top 10 favorite films. It's my favorite Carpenter film. Sorry, the fucking Halloween, but I like The Thing more. And it's got a great feel to it. It still feels very 80s, but it also doesn't. Like, it could be set in any time period outside of the fact of cellular devices. Any time before the 90s, more or less, makes sense for it to exist. So this fact that it came out in the 80s doesn't exactly reflect on the time period doesn't really reflect in the film when you think about it. Of course, there's the hairdos, the costuming, and the technology, but with the simple things of the people, the place, and the alien, does that really make it seem very 80s? It's a 50s premise as it is, because it was made in the fucking 50s or 40s as a book first, and then came out as a film in the 50s. You know, what is it? Who Goes There was the original book, and then you've got The Thing from Another World was the original release in the 50s, which again, Carpenter had referenced in Halloween, because the kids were watching it that night on Halloween. Fright Night, I don't think people talk enough about Fright Night. I don't hear much discourse about it. I love it. It's my favorite vampire film, and I have the Eureka 4K remaster. I even did a video for October this year on Fright Night versus Fright Night, which was, the old versus the new. And, not many people even watch that, because I don't think many people care that much about Fright Night. Because vampire films, unfortunately, you usually stick to a grouping of them, because they can be very generic. You've got your Dracula, you've got your suburban vampire, you've got your romantic vampire. That's pretty much the dichotomy of vampire films, or TV shows. You're not really going to get much else. Sometimes you're going to get a crossover between them, like Interview of a Vampire, Sexy Vampire meets Urban Vampire, even classical vampire. That's like a mix of all three of them. So, you've either got your Draculas, which is still practically Nosferatu, or you've just got random fucking vampire dude who lives in the, house next door, and I believe he's a vampire, but I gotta kill him first, And even that was based on the TV show Fright Night. So, yeah, it's not so iconic. It's still very 80s, very iconically 80s, but not so much the ultimate film in this category. It doesn't have, it still has a great gory stuff and a fun cast and a very 80s feel, atmosphere, hairdos, all that jazz. Very much 80s film, but it doesn't seem to stretch past the 80s too much into its modern day referencing. It's just not really there. I know they made a remake, but again, Tom Holland was a part of that remake as much as he was the original. And then there's The Fly, which, again, I think because it's Cronenberg, a lot of people can't handle Cronenberg. A lot of people like him and know about him, and this, of course, made Jeff Goldblum, fucking put him on the map, and made him sexy and horrifying all in the same film. How the fuck did they manage that? Easy, Cronenberg. And that's the thing, because it's like Cronenberg seems like John Carpenter. He has a few hits here and there, but for the most part, a lot of his films can be in the dust for most casual audiences. The Fly is probably his most well-known film, arguably next to Scanners, and most regular audiences don't know what the fuck Scanners is. They might only know it of recent memory because of the guy's head exploding being a GIF, So I don't think it's so iconically the ultimate 80s film. It has the effects and the hairdo, and it has the bizarre premise, but at the same time, it's also a remake of the 1950s film with Vincent Price. So, that's why I don't think it really sticks out so well like that as well, because it has the prior version of it. In fact, that was a trilogy originally: The Fly, The Fly 2, and Son of the Fly. Or is it The Fly Returns, and Son of the Fly? And then this one is just The Fly and The Fly 2. So, yeah. But then there's The Evil Dead, which I still consider the most ultimate 80s film, simply because of those few structures. The low-budget effects, the first-time filmmaking, which was very big in the 80s, and midnight movie screening, hugely big in the 80s. It's a film that's still referenced to today throughout all kinds of films, whether they're cult classics like Donnie Darko, or whether they're being, redone. The amount of, it made, 2 more sequels, a reboot, and a 3-season TV show? that's still been popular today. The Evil Dead is referenced all over the place, from the Necronomicon Ex Mortis, not originally from the Evil Dead, I know, but Ash Williams is such an iconic horror villain, even though more so for Evil Dead 2, which I would argue was maybe the more ultimate 80s film, but this isn't on that. It isn't on this list. But I'd still actually say that if you're looking for horror, Evil Dead perfectly does it. It has a beautifully horror atmosphere, so it has that from The Shining. You've got the low-budget nature like Friday the 13th. You've got the low-budget gore that's also really cheesy but funny, but also kind of scary. Depends on how it goes, whether it's the stop-motion stuff, whether it's all the makeup and blood effects, the white contacts. All that you similarly have on stuff like Fright Night and The Thing. But with less mastery, which makes it feel more iconic. Because it has this feel of a cheapness, the horror doesn't always need to perfectly strike you, but it still has, adds this effect of an amusement to it. We can kind of laugh at how cheesy the effects are, but this is low-ass budget stuff, which is really good. I know Ash Williams isn't so iconic in the first film, but since then, he has become much more iconic of a character. He was very much a wimp in the first one, as it is. But at the same time, you still have the Necronomicon Ex Mortis. You've got this great soundtrack to it. Again, the visuals of the camera running around as this evil entity. I know you've got that tree scene, which I won't mention the word because YouTube doesn't like using particular words. But that tree scene, again, iconic. Not exactly necessary in either the first one or the second film, and realistically, probably shouldn't be in either of them, but, it's the 80s. It's just a thing that's there. I still think I think it adds to the horror enough, and again, iconically enough, because of how messed up it is. That's, horrific enough as it is, that these evil entities, these evil demons, will possess the nature around it to do such destructive things to a person, to such an innocent woman. So, yeah, look, the film has this nature to it. Again, the low-budget thing is really the key thing. Low-budget mixed with midnight screening popularity. It's just got some great stuff to it. It's got an iconic enough ending. It's got a classic, again, made its own fucking genre, which none of these 80s films did. Friday the 13th, all these other films were... you could see other versions of beforehand, more or less. The slasher film was already done before. The vampire film was already done before. The ghost film was already done before. The science experiment film was already done before. This is the one of this list. I'll double check the list, but I'm pretty fucking certain that, yeah, The Thing was done before. The Shining, again, it's just a ghost film. Nightmare on Elm Street is just a slasher film. Yeah, they've all been done before, whereas The Evil Dead is purely iconic for what it is. It created the Cabin in the Woods genre, made that an iconic thing, and just, made this whole people get possessed by demons more iconic. That was already a thing, especially in ghost story films, but this was to a different level, especially because it related to teenagers. That was a good audience for it, much like Friday the 13th, but a fuck ton more interesting. It still characterized the people enough and our hero enough, rather than just having random people die at random times, and it had some great iconic and goofy moments. All this stuff was built upon in the second film, but we're only here talking about the first film, which I have a video on talking about the first and second film as well. So ultimately, that's why I believe that through this iMDb category of 8 films, The Evil Dead, out of all these 8 films, is the most iconic horror film. So, yeah, I'm probably going to have a lot of people jump into this video and be like, wait, why didn't you mention this film or this film or this film? That's why at the start of the video I mentioned the list that they posted up. So I just kind of wanted to make a video on that. Thank you, iMDb, for giving me a video. I know it's not October, I can't talk about horror films anymore. What is this shit? No, it's Christmas time, bitch. Ho, ho, ho. I got some for my birthday. But yeah, ultimately, look, that's just my thoughts and opinions on this. If you disagree, I would love to say that The Thing is the most iconic of those 80s films, the ultimate 80s horror, but it's it wasn't iconic at the time, so I can't count it, And that's just how it be. So outside of that, thank you all so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, feel free to like, share, and subscribe for more. I have a video on other, obviously, I'll put my horror playlist here, but I've got the Evil Dead one, the Fright Night one as well, So hopefully I can link all those videos. Maybe if I dive in the corner here, you'll be able to do it. I don't know. You can also subscribe. Outside of that, thank you so much for watching. If you have different opinions, comment section is down there. I'm happy to listen to your arguments as to why my opinion at least is wrong, or if you agree with my opinion. Nevertheless, see you next time. Adios.